"Clean your desk, pack your things, and get out of my building." He said it standing in the open doorway of the break room, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. Loud enough that the conversation at the copy machine stopped, and the woman on the phone in the corner cubicle put the call on hold, and the intern who had just started that week looked up with the particular startled expression of someone witnessing their first earthquake. The man delivering the order was the regional manager, 47 years old, a second-generation hire at a company whose founder was his uncle's college roommate, a man who had survived 3 internal HR reviews by the precise mechanism of being adjacent to power that was inconvenient to challenge. The employee he was addressing was standing at the coffee machine. Her name was Vanessa Okafor. She was 34 years old. She was a senior compliance analyst, had been for 3 years. She held 2 degrees and a professional certification that the company had in fact paid for because they had recognized when they hired her that she was exactly the kind of meticulous, unflappable, detail-oriented person that compliance work requires and rarely finds. She turned from the coffee machine slowly. She looked at him with the expression of someone who is not surprised because they have been watching something approach from a long way off. "For what cause?" she said evenly. "Performance," he said. "You know why." She did not look away from him. "I'd like that in writing. You'll get what you get. Pack your desk." Nobody in that break room said a word. 8 colleagues, some of whom had eaten lunch with Vanessa every week for 3 years, and not one voice, not one question. The quiet of people who understand, with terrible clarity, the cost of speaking. He had no idea she had already spoken. 3 months ago, to people with considerably more authority than him. He had no idea what those conversations had set in motion, or that it was already too late to stop what was coming, or that the 4 people who would walk through the front door of this building 3 hours and 17 minutes from now had been preparing for this visit for 11 weeks. Have you ever watched something wrong happen in front of you and felt the floor tilt under your feet? Not sure whether the braver thing was to speak or to wait? Let me take you back. 16 months earlier, Vanessa Okafor had taken the compliance analyst position at Meridian Financial Partners because it was exactly what her skill set was built for and because, in the 3 rounds of interviews, every person she had spoken to had said some version of the same thing. "We take our compliance obligations seriously, and we want people who aren't afraid to raise concerns." She had written that down afterward. Not because she was naive, she was not naive, but because she believed in the value of documentation. If those words turned out to be true, they were worth keeping. If they turned out not to be true, they were worth keeping for different reasons. She had been good at the job from the first month, she was precise, she was fast, she understood regulatory frameworks with the kind of fluency that comes from genuine interest rather than rote study. She had flagged 2 compliance gaps in her first quarter. Procedural things, not serious, the kind of issues that emerge in organizations that are growing faster than their internal controls are keeping pace with. And both had been corrected without drama. She had thought in those early months that this might be a place where her skills were genuinely valued. Then the regional manager, whose name was Douglas Freed, had been promoted. Douglas Freed was not a stupid man. He was something more operationally dangerous, a smart man whose intelligence had been entirely organized around self-protection. He had learned early in his career that the most effective way to manage upward was to present the appearance of competent leadership while ensuring that any information that threatened his position never traveled beyond the immediate situation. He did not falsify reports, that was too crude, too traceable. What he did was something subtler. He managed the framing. He chose what got escalated and what got resolved quietly. He chose whose findings got visibility and whose got filed. When Vanessa Okafor began flagging what she was flagging, Douglas Freed began managing the framing around Vanessa Okafor. It had started 8 months into his tenure. Vanessa had been conducting a routine audit of fee disclosure practices in the firm's retail advisory division when she found something that was not routine at all. The discrepancy was specific, repeated, and patterned in a way that distinguished it from error. It had the shape of intent. Certain client accounts, specifically accounts held by elderly clients with limited financial literacy, were being assessed fees that were inconsistently disclosed in their account documentation. The under-disclosed fees were small individually, between $14 and $47 per quarter per account, but there were, by Vanessa's count, approximately 1,400 affected accounts, and the pattern had been running for at least 3 years. The total under-disclosed amount was not astronomical. What made it significant was not the dollar figure but the regulatory classification. Fee disclosure failures of this specific type applied systematically to a protected class of clients, elderly, vulnerable, triggered mandatory reporting obligations under Federal Financial Consumer Protection Statute. This was not a gray area. This was not a matter of interpretation. This was a box on a form that either got checked or didn't. Vanessa had brought it to Douglas Freed. She had written a memo. She had attached the supporting data. She had been precise and specific and had recommended immediate voluntary disclosure to the regulatory body, which was both the legally correct course of action and, in her professional experience, the approach that resulted in the most favorable regulatory treatment. Voluntary disclosure, in these circumstances, typically resulted in a consent agreement and remediation requirements. Non-disclosure, if the pattern was later identified by regulators independently, was a different situation entirely. Douglas Freed had read the memo. He had nodded in a way that communicated understanding without committing to action. He had told her he would review it with the executive team. He had told her this twice over the following 3 weeks. He had told her, in a one-on-one meeting in his office 6 weeks after the memo, that the matter had been reviewed and that the executive team's assessment was that the disclosure characterization was not as clear-cut as her analysis suggested, and that they were seeking outside legal counsel. Outside legal counsel had been sought and had apparently concluded something. Douglas Freed had never shared the conclusion with Vanessa. When she followed up 3 weeks later, she was told the matter was under review. When she followed up again, she was told she needed to trust the process. When she followed up a third time, Douglas Freed had leaned back in his chair and told her, in the tone of a man offering a gift, that her role as a compliance analyst was to surface issues, not to manage outcomes, and that she should be careful not to let her professional judgment stray into territory that wasn't hers to operate in. She had written that down too. Date, time, exact words. She had a notebook. It was a small spiral notebook, black cover, the kind you could buy at any drugstore. She had started keeping it the week after the second non-response to her memo, and by the time Douglas Freed fired her in the break room, it contained 7 months of precisely dated, precisely worded entries. What he didn't know, what Douglas Freed in all his practiced intelligence about managing information had completely failed to account for, was that 5 months before the firing, Vanessa Okafor had contacted the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She had not done it impulsively. She had consulted with an attorney first. She had been advised of her rights under the whistleblower protection provisions of Dodd-Frank. She had been told, plainly, that if her characterization of the fee disclosure pattern was accurate, she had not only the right, but arguably the obligation to report it. She had sent a formal written submission. She had attached her original memo, the supporting data, and the documentation of Douglas Freed's non-responses. She had sent it on a Tuesday afternoon from a computer at the public library, and she had taken the bus home, and she had cooked dinner, and she had called her mother in Houston, and she had not told anyone at work. The Bureau had acknowledged her submission within 2 weeks. A field investigation had begun within 6 weeks. 2 investigators had been assigned. The investigation had, in the 11 weeks that followed, identified not only the fee disclosure pattern Vanessa had documented, but 3 additional compliance failures in adjacent areas that her original analysis had not reached. The scope had expanded. Other agencies had been briefed. The preparation for the site visit, the formal announced federal agents walking through the front door variety of site visit, had been underway for 3 weeks when Douglas Freed walked into that break room. He had fired her on a Tuesday. The 4 federal investigators arrived on a Tuesday as well. Precisely 3 hours and 17 minutes after Vanessa had carried her box of personal items, the framed photo of her parents, her spare certification materials, the small potted plant she'd had on her desk since her first week, out to her car in the parking garage. She heard about the visit from a former colleague who texted her at 12:47. 4 people just walked in with federal ID, compliance and legal just got called into the conference room. Nobody's coming out. She read the text, sitting in her car in the parking garage. She had not driven away yet. She had been sitting there for 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was not because she was paralyzed but because she had been on the phone, first with her attorney, then with her mother, then with her attorney again. She put her phone face down on the passenger seat. She looked at the parking garage wall. Then she took the black notebook out of her purse and checked the date of the most recent entry. She made one more, Tuesday. The date, time, 12:47 p.m. She wrote, "They came." The site visit lasted 4 hours. 2 of the investigators stayed a second day. The executive team, which had apparently been told by outside counsel that the regulatory exposure was manageable, discovered on day 1 of the visit that it was not manageable in the way they had been told. The scope of the investigation included not only the fee disclosure pattern but trading irregularities in 3 institutional accounts that the expanded investigation had surfaced. These irregularities were not related to Vanessa's original complaint. They were significantly more serious. Douglas Freed was placed on administrative leave the day after the investigators left. The announcement was made internally, in a company-wide email from the firm's CEO that was notable primarily for its complete absence of any explanation of what Douglas Freed had done or not done. The email expressed appreciation for his years of service. It did not mention the investigation. Several colleagues texted Vanessa. She did not respond to any of them that day. The formal regulatory action was announced publicly 8 weeks later. The Bureau's consent order was 43 pages. It required Meridian Financial Partners to remediate all affected client accounts, 1,847 accounts in the final count, more than Vanessa's initial estimate, at a total remediation value of $2. $1 million. It required a $4, $3 million civil penalty. It required the appointment of an independent compliance monitor for 3 years. The order named the fee disclosure pattern. It described in the careful neutral language of regulatory documents exactly what Vanessa's memo had described, in the same terms, 11 months earlier. The order did not mention Vanessa by name. Her name appeared in the Bureau's press release, in a section noting that the investigation had been initiated in response to a whistleblower complaint. The press release described the whistleblower protection provisions and commended the original submission as thorough and well documented. It was 2 sentences. They were enough. Douglas Freed's administrative leave converted to termination 6 weeks after the public announcement. His LinkedIn profile went dark. Industry colleagues, reached by a reporter covering the regulatory action for a financial trade publication, declined to comment. One, speaking anonymously, described him as someone who had played a very sophisticated game for a very long time and had finally played it against someone who played a more sophisticated one. Vanessa's attorney filed a wrongful termination and retaliation claim under Dodd-Frank whistleblower protection provisions on the same day the public announcement was made. The claim was straightforward. The timeline was documented in precise, dated, worded entries in a small black spiral notebook purchased at a drugstore. The timing of the firing, 3 months after the Bureau submission, following 7 months of documented non-response and obstruction, was not subtle. These cases, her attorney told her, were rarely subtle. The settlement was reached 5 months later. Terms were confidential. Vanessa's attorney, asked by the same trade publication reporter whether his client was satisfied with the outcome, said yes, and that she had been made whole, and that she was looking forward to returning to work in the field she genuinely loved. Vanessa took 3 weeks off. She visited her parents in Houston. She went through the black notebook from beginning to end. All the entries, all the dates, all the exact words she had written down when it would have been easier to let them blur. She did not throw it away. She kept it on the bookshelf in her home office. She returned to work in October. New employer, a mid-sized firm with a compliance department that had reached out to her through her attorney during the settlement negotiations, which she had found professionally interesting and personally gratifying. In her first week, she attended an all-hands meeting where the CEO said, "We take our compliance obligations seriously, and we want people who aren't afraid to raise concerns." She wrote it down, same as before, for the same 2 reasons as before. She was good at her job from the first month. She was precise. She was fast. She flagged a procedural gap in her second week, the kind of thing that emerges in organizations growing faster than their internal controls, and it was corrected without drama. She bought a new notebook. Same kind. Black cover. Drugstore. She kept it in her desk, because that is what you do when you have learned that the difference between something being wrong and something being corrected is often nothing more than the willingness to write it down, sign your name to it, and refuse to let it disappear into a drawer. The clients whose fees had been undisclosed, 1,847 of them, most of them elderly, many of them with limited financial sophistication, who had simply trusted that the institution managing their savings was being honest with them, received their remediation payments over a 14-month period. Most received between $180 and $640. For some of them, the checks came with no explanation they fully understood. For a few, a letter from a community banking advocate explained what had happened and why. Most of them never knew anyone's name. Most of them never knew about the memo or the notebook or the Tuesday in the break room or the 4 people who walked through the front door 3 hours and 17 minutes later. That is how it usually works. The person who fixes the thing is rarely the person who gets the credit for the thing being fixed. The notebook full of dates and exact words and the coffee machine and the box of personal items carried to the parking garage, that is the part that doesn't make it into the press release. But it is the whole story. If this story hit something in you, if you've ever been the person in the break room or the person who saw it happen and looked down, hit like, share this, subscribe, and ring the bell, Tell me in the comments, have you ever raised a concern at work and been ignored or worse, penalized for it? What did you do? Here's what really gets me. It's not the 4 federal agents walking through the door. That's the machinery. That's the system working eventually when someone forces it to. What gets me is the notebook. A black spiral notebook from a drugstore. 7 months of dates and times and exact words, kept by a woman who had every reason to believe she was writing into a void, who had been told by the person with power over her career to trust the process and stay in her lane and let the people in charge handle what was theirs to handle. She trusted a different process. She documented everything. She filed her complaint from a public library on a Tuesday afternoon and then went home and cooked dinner, not because she was certain it would work, but because it was right and because she had written it down, and because a wrong thing that is documented is a wrong thing that can eventually be answered for. Douglas Freed fired her in front of 8 colleagues who said nothing. 3 hours later, 4 federal investigators walked in, and the whole building found out what happens when you spend years managing the framing around someone who's been quietly keeping the record. What's the thing you know that you've been afraid to write down? Tell me below.